welcome. Welcome to Sunday morning meeting at the Humanists of Greater Portland. I'm Helen Christians and I'll be your MC this morning. I'm so glad that you were able to join us. You're in for a real treat. This is going to be a great program. HGP is an all-volunteer group that believes strongly in freedom of speech. Humanists believe in a progressive philosophy that without supernaturalism advocates living an ethical life based on science, reason, and free inquiry. The American Humanist Association has developed a list of behaviors associated with the humanist philosophy. One of these behaviors is environmentalism, and the promise that, that humanists make that I will take care of the earth and the life on it. Regardless of our individual identities, we all share the same home, planet Earth. Just as we depend on the planet to sustain us with its precious resources, this planet's ecosystem depends on us to be good stewards and take responsibility for the impact human activity has on our shared planet. Disregard for the larger scale impacts humans have on our environment has caused extensive harm to the Earth's ecosystem. Despite this, humanity is also capable of positive environmental changes that values the interdependence of all life on this planet. Each of us must acknowledge our collective and individual mistakes, repair past damages, and purposefully work toward cultivating rich, diverse, and resilient ecosystems. Lauren Beauregard will be doing our reading this morning. Welcome, Lauren.
The reading this morning is actually inspired by something that George Carlin did some years ago. I suppose that in our membership, we have a number of George Carlin fans. I like every once in a while to go back to YouTube and see some of the things that he did. One particular thing that he did had to do with claiming to be a sun worshiper. And this is where this takes off from. So what I've done is I've composed a brief secular humanist sermon. This is in the form of a sermon, and it is inspired by Carlin. So here goes. Do you believe in a higher power? Are you spiritual? Do you think that anything is sacred, literally? No, 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 I hear you saying. You are secular. You reject that kind of stuff. Well, I have a confession to make. I believe in a higher power. I believe in the sun. The sun is higher, and the sun is a power. Therefore, the sun is a higher power. Sunshine on my shoulder makes me happy. There's more. I am spiritual. Some people think that spiritual means supernatural. Dearly beloved, let us see what being spiritual might involve. For starters, feeling gratitude is spiritual. I feel gratitude. I'm thankful. You may ask, to whom am I thankful? The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. When I count my blessings, I just feel lucky. We can all do this. Count our blessings, feel gratitude, feel secular gratitude. What about counting other people's blessings? Well, that could be envy. You might not want to go there. What else is spiritual? Love. Love is spiritual. Certainly, love is not material, unless, of course, you're paying for it. You are loving. You are thankful. You want to reduce misery in the world, and you're concerned about the climate crisis. Come on, admit it. This is spiritual. There's something going on with us beyond science and reason. What is it? Well, there's art, music, poetry, Chaucer, Michelangelo, Mozart, Chuck Berry, Leonard Cohen. Art, music, and poetry sometimes comes with a religious frosting, but really it's just secular. And to come full circle, we would have none of the arts were it not for the higher power, were it not for the sun. Someday the sun will die. But surely we can say that the sun will not have existed in vain. And we know that the sun will not have died because of our sins.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you so much. I'd like to welcome now Dr. Elizabeth Hennessy. Dr. Hennessy is an associate professor of history, history of science, and environmental studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research combines environmental history, political ecology, science and technology studies, and multi-species studies with a regional focus on Latin America. Her research is funded by the National Science Foundation, the Social Science Research Council, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the Rachel Carson Center for Environmental and Society at LMU Munich. Her first book, On the Backs of Tortoises, Darwin, the Galápagos, and the Fate of an Evolutionary Eden, was published by Yale University Press in 2019 and was a finalist for the 2020 Penn Wilson Literary Science Writing Award. She completed her PhD in geography at the University of Chapel Hill in 2014. Welcome, Dr. Hennessy.
Thank you so much, Helen and Joyce, for the invitation today. Well, it was an honor to be asked to do this, and the weather here in Madison is foggy and misty rain, so I feel like I'm with you in Portland, despite the miles. I'm going to talk about this book that I wrote and published 2 years ago, almost now. It's a year and a half. So let me share my screen and get started. There we go. So I have the great fortune to work in the Galápagos Islands, and I focus there on their most iconic species, the giant tortoises. I never expected to write a book about turtles, but when I first went to the Galápagos as a grad student in 2007, I quickly realized that I wasn't going to be able to make sense of the place unless I took the tortoises seriously. They seem really to be everywhere in the islands. You can see hundreds of baby tortoises on display at breeding centers that exist on 3 different islands. They are plastered on billboards for tourism companies. They're in every souvenir shop. They are used to advertise local products. And they're painted on murals and schoolhouse walls. And they can even be found getting drunk down at the corner bar. But silly tortoise images aside, I am going to ask you to put your herpetology hats on with me this morning. As I started researching the history of the archipelago, the tortoises seemed to become ever more central. For centuries, islands were known to explorers, buccaneers, and whalers sailing the Pacific as a storehouse of natural resources. They went for water, timber, and above all, the giant tortoises, which were considered a most delicious source of fresh meat and fat. In the 16th century, Spanish sailors encountering the New World named the archipelago for its tastiest resources. Galápago is an old Spanish word for tortoise. And today, of course, the hundreds of thousands of tourists who visit the Galápagos, at least up until a year ago, they would never dream of eating the tortoises. They're now seen as charismatic endangered species, icons of conservation, and a place that's often called a natural laboratory of evolution. And this change is in part due to Charles Darwin, of course. I imagine you all know that Darwin visited the Galápagos in 1835 during the Beagle voyage. And he was quite taken not only with the finches and the mockingbirds that he collected, but also with marine iguanas and the tortoises, which he wrote seemed to my fancy like some antediluvian animals. Now, all of this tortoise history evokes an old story that some of you may know. This is actually the story that I begin the book with. And so I will read it, or my version of it, to you to set the talk up today. Now, I've heard this story many times. I think it is as likely to be legend as true. It supposedly took place in an auditorium or a university lecture hall in the early 20th century, where the philosopher William James, or maybe it was philosopher and mathematician Bertrand Russell, stood before a crowded room giving a talk on recent theories of cosmology. At the end of the lecture, as members of the audience started asking questions, an elderly woman in the back made her way to the front of the room. When her turn to speak she declared, "Your talk was very interesting, Mr. James, but it's wrong. We all know that the earth really rests on the back of a turtle." James raised his eyebrows, but nodded respectfully and replied, but then what does the turtle stand on? And the old lady replied, that's easy. The turtle stands on the back of a second, far larger turtle. Amused, James persisted to see what might happen if he asked one more time. But what does that second turtle stand on? The old woman smiled and shook her head. Very clever, Mr. James, but it's turtles all the way down. Now, every time I've heard that story, the teller interprets it a little bit differently. And the question is, how are we supposed to understand the old woman's claim the world rests on the backs of turtles? What is it about that story that makes it so memorable? Her insistence on the stack of turtles, I think, reminds some readers of something out of a Dr. Seuss book. But we laugh a little uneasily at the punchline because it invites us to doubt our own certainties. Do we really know that she's wrong? In a number of non-Western cultures, turtles play foundational roles in origin stories. And in drawing a contrast between two ways of knowing the world, the story points to a deeper truth about the ground we stand on, the things that we take for granted without really knowing them to be true. Take, for instance, how the physicist Stephen Hawking interpreted the story to introduce his brief history of time. In a book that explains research on some of the most challenging contemporary questions about the nature of the universe, including the Big Bang and black holes, Hawking opens with the old woman and her turtles to remind readers that the basis for our knowledge of the cosmos may turn out to be not much sturdier than her tower of turtles. We may find her claim to be ridiculous, he writes, but why do we think we know better? Our knowledge is uncertain, Hawking reminds us, and is always a work in progress. The ground on which we stand isn't quite as solid as we might like to imagine. Now, this Turtles All the Way Down story is a tale, a metaphor, but the book is actually about a real place where I think that the old woman's claim rings true. The Galápagos, I think there, the world as we know it rests on the backs not of turtles, but of giant tortoises. And I don't mean that anyone who lives in the Galápagos believes literally that the earth or the islands rest on an infinite pile of these enormous reptiles. But I mean that these land-dwelling animals have fundamentally shaped the history of the archipelago. The Galápagos just wouldn't be the same place without them. The giant tortoises are today charismatic icons of conservation, but they're much more than that too. I've been visiting the islands for more than a decade now, and the more I return, the more deeply I'm struck by the many different meanings and roles the tortoises carry. What it means to rest on their backs is far more complicated, ethically ambiguous, and fascinating than I could have imagined when I first stepped ashore. Much like Stephen Hawking's pondering of the implications of black holes for understanding of time, I've learned that the Turtles All the Way Down history of the Galápagos is far less certain and straightforward than it appears. Now, I'll explain what I mean by that as I tell some stories about different tortoises today. But first I want to state a provocation. This is also central to the book. And that's the idea that the Galápagos have a tortoise problem. Now, I don't mean a problem with saving the endangered species themselves. The Galápagos conservationists have actually been quite successful at breeding and rearing tortoises. But instead, I mean a problem with what the giant tortoises represent. To explain, let me turn to another version of the Turtles All the Way Down story, this one told by the philosopher of science, Isabel Stengers. In a book that focuses on the power of scientific theories to modify society and the power of social thought to shape science, she uses the story to question the foundation of modern knowledge. She recounts much the same story as Hawking, asking whether there's much difference between the old lady's turtles and the fundamental laws of physics. Both theories posit a world that could, in principle, be fully explained. What differs are the elements of that explanation, be they an infinite stack of turtles or the quarks that physicists currently understand to be the fundamental building blocks of matter. Both reflect what philosophers call the turtle problem of infinite regress, a never-ending quest for solid ground. In the story, both the old woman and Hawking have us searching endlessly for an ever larger turtle or an ever smaller subatomic particle as the basis for knowledge. Well, the tortoise problem of conservation is similar, a stubbornly enticing and yet impossible desire to restore a world of prehistoric nature, to go back to Eden. What's at stake in saving the Galapagos is not only saving giant tortoises and other unique wildlife from extinction, it's also saving the foundational site of a secular scientific origin story, a biological and geological Eden. It's about saving the place that Darwin once wrote was the origin of all my views. As a BBC documentary series put it, these are the islands that changed the world, the place that changed our understanding of life on Earth. Now, since the mid-20th century, scientists have worked to conserve evolution in this natural laboratory. But Darwin never called the islands an Eden. I think he might well have liked the metaphor because he carried John Milton's story about Adam and Eve, Paradise Lost, with him whenever he went ashore from the Beagle. But the idea of an evolutionary Eden is a contradiction. Ironically, trying to preserve the Galapagos as an Eden, conservation biologists have attempted to restore the very foundation of life that was shattered by Darwin's emphasis on evolutionary process all the way down. In the Galapagos, giant tortoises anchor conservationist desire to restore the islands to a pre-human world. Their plodding, creaky gait, leathery skin, and worn armor certainly make them look the part of animals from a land before time. By many measures, conservationists have been quite successful at saving this place. To conserve evolution, biologists have sought to protect the island's historical isolation. Conservationists estimate the islands retain 95% of their original or pre-1535 endemic biodiversity. That's a really impressive statistic, a much higher rate of surviving endemic species than you can find in Hawaii, for example. The Galapagos archipelago is among the world's most striking conservation success stories. But despite all the good that conservation has achieved, this way of trying to save life will never bring back Eden. Evolution, as conservation biologists well know, cannot be rewound. And as the tortoises' own histories make clear, the islands are far from pristine. But more significant than that, their stories call into question a way of thinking about nature that suggests that the islands even could be pristine. So in exploring some tortoise stories today, I want to address the questions of why has this idea that the archipelago is a natural laboratory come to guide conservation in the Galapagos, and what have been the effects of that metaphor? Now, the book argues that restoring an evolutionary Eden is something of a red herring, that the work of conservation is really about entanglement of humans and non-humans all the way down. But first, I'll tell you a little bit about my methods and give a bit of an introduction to the Galapagos. So this is me and some of my research sites. The top left photo is a picture of me at the British Museum of Natural History doing archival work. The photo below that of the taxidermy tortoise is from the American Museum of Natural History in New York. The picture of me following the ecologist Freddie Cabrera and a giant tortoise on a very muddy path was taken in Santa Cruz Island when I was following Freddie and a couple of his collaborators who are doing a radio telemetry project about tortoises. They're tracking the way that they migrate up and down the slopes of these dormant volcanoes. I also volunteered, and I'll talk a little bit about this later, at the Giant Tortoise Breeding Center on Santa Cruz Island. So that's me in the green t-shirt on the left, scrubbing the little wading pool of a tortoise who was named as Lonesome George, who's here in the background, with another volunteer and a man named Fausto Urena, for whom this breeding center is actually named. He's worked with the tortoises, or he did before he retired, for more than 30 years, taking care of these animals and helping to raise their young. So I did what I consider mixed methods, so ethnographic research, which consisted of shadowing scientists, doing a lot of interviews with conservationists, with scientists, and with folks who just live in the Galapagos to get their perspectives. I also did participant observation at the breeding center with this telemetry project. And then I also did archival research at a number of different archives in the US and in Europe and in Ecuador and the Galapagos as well. Now this is a map of Galapagos from the book. As you can see, there are 13 large islands in the archipelago, They were once home to 15 different species of giant tortoise. Now, 4 of those species went extinct because of predation by sailors and island colonists, or at least we thought so until recently. You might have seen the news last year that an Animal Planet expedition to the westernmost island of Fernandina actually turned up 1 female tortoise. It was the first tortoise that had been seen on that island in 115 years. And so this tells us that extinction isn't always as permanent as we might think it is. Now on this map, the dark gray islands have extant or existing tortoise species. The lighter gray islands like Floriana are where tortoises have gone extinct. And I am going to focus today on Santiago Island here in the middle of the archipelago. So let me tell you about the Santiago Island tortoise. The scientific name is Chelinoidus darwini. It was named, of course, for Charles Darwin. And it was named by a man named John Vandenberg, who was the curator of herpetology at the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco. It was named in 1907. Now, Vandenberg wanted to memorialize Darwin, and scientists often name species after friends, colleagues, or important predecessors. Well, the Santiago tortoises are one of many things named for Darwin in the Galápagos. There's a research station, a couple of streets. I've met several little boys there named Darwin. And if you've been to the Galápagos, you know that Darwin is heroized in the archipelago as a kind of patron saint of Galápagos science and conservation. You run into him everywhere, it seems. Here he is on an arch that is overlooking the creatures of the Galápagos. This is very close to the entrance to the national park on Santa Cruz Island. You can't quite make out his godlike visage. There he is up close. You can see him in the Charles Darwin Research Station in a little makeshift office, and even out front of a cafe where you can get coffee and frozen yogurt. But these images of Darwin as the wise old sage who crafted the concept of evolution are really a far cry from the young man who actually visited the islands. So let me tell you about Darwin's experience on Santiago that inspired Vandenberg to name these tortoises after him. On a sunny day in October of 1835, a 26-year-old Darwin hiked from the parched coast of Santiago Island to the island's green, damp highlands, where he was taken with the giant tortoises he found. After a long walk, he sat in the shade and watched them as they ambled along broad roads that had been trodden by their elephant-like feet over countless generations. He timed their gait faster than he supposed, measured their carapaces, 6 and 8 feet in circumference, and tried to lift them, some way well over 500 pounds. Finding their weight too much, he climbed aboard, rapping on their shells and trying not to slip off their backs as they trudged along. Riding tortoises is today, of course, not among the approved ways of following in Darwin's footsteps in the Galápagos. And tourists may observe the animals that Darwin saw, but they're not permitted to do as he did. Recreating the experiences of the Darwin who actually walked the islands would mean doing a host of things that are now prohibited by national park rules, trying to net the birds with your hat or catching iguanas by the tail and dissecting their stomachs to see what they ate. But perhaps worst of all would be doing what Darwin did after a day spent observing tortoises, feasting on them. In the highlands of Santiago, Darwin spent 2 days camping with local tortoise hunters, during which time he subsisted on nothing but the animals. The Spaniard hunters, as Darwin called them, were actually political exiles from the new state of Ecuador who were collecting meat for a colony on another island. For dinner, they made tortoise carne con cuero in the style of Argentinian gauchos, roasting meat on the breastplate and frying it in tortoise fat. Jotting down his impression of the meal afterward, Darwin deemed it very good, although he preferred the capital soup made of young tortoises. Now, this Darwin would be abhorred by the supposedly conservationist graybeard Darwin who watches over the islands today. But even as an old man, Darwin didn't see the Galápagos through the eyes of an environmentalist intent on protecting nature. That first Darwin statue was actually a product of mid-20th century campaigns to preserve the islands when international conservationists heroized the naturalists to protect the archipelago as what they saw as a natural laboratory of evolution. And so I wanted to tell this story, and I will get back to the natural laboratory of evolution, because it was Vandenberg who, he didn't mention this part of the story, the Darwin eating tortoises, when he wrote up the scientific description that explained why he wanted to name the tortoises after Darwin. He just wrote about Darwin's natural history observations. And I think that that is an important turning point and an important piece of the story of the Santiago Island tortoises, because it was Vandenberg who published the first monograph establishing that there were 15 different species, or races, as he called them in the early 20th century, and that when Darwin was in the Galapagos, both the vice governor of the colony to which those local tortoise hunters belonged and the tortoise hunters themselves told Darwin that they could tell what island a tortoise came from just because they all looked slightly different. Now, in retrospect, that was a huge hint about evolution, but Darwin wrote later that he regretted not paying very much attention to it at the time. And unlike the finches, he didn't collect tortoises as natural history specimens. The beagle actually only took them aboard as food. And it was Vandenberg's monograph that vindicated what the colonists and Darwin thought to be true, that each island had a different species. And you can see this specimen here, 8109. This is the type specimen from Santiago that is stored in a back room at the Cal Academy still today. It's the animal that Vandenberg measured and described when he named the species. Vandenberg was the first also to write about the survival status of the tortoises, from extinct, like the Floriana species, to rare, like those on Santiago, to others that were abundant. Now, up until this point, scientists had tried to save tortoises primarily by collecting and taxidermying specimens for museums. But Vandenberg's monograph was a turning point for the animals, because it was in the 1920s and 1930s that scientists first began campaigning to establish a national park in the Galapagos, and more emphasis was put on trying to save living animals. And so in the 1930s, following another Cal Academy expedition to the archipelago, Harry Swartz, who was an ornithologist, called on Ecuador to create an outdoor biological laboratory in the archipelago, which he called one of the most amazing natural laboratories of evolutionary processes on Earth. So it was at this point that the Galapagos started to become known as a natural laboratory. And the idea of this natural laboratory suggests a remote, isolated, and controlled space where scientists would have access to the last remnants of pristine nature and could study unimpeded natural processes. For biologists, the metaphor wasn't an oxymoron that juxtaposed the unruliness of wildlife with the enclosed sterility of a more traditional site of scientific experiment. Rather, it reflected the scientific value of the archipelago as a place where nature ran experiments. The Galapagos provided a unique landscape for field-based study, where the simplicity of life on stark and scarcely populated volcanoes helped to make processes of evolution visible. The islands were an exceptional place where biologists could actually study evolution in situ. The tortoises were central objects of that laboratory world, as were other native species, including finches, penguins, flamingos, albatross, and flightless cormorants. For biologists, protecting these animals within a nature reserve was the way to preserve the utility of the natural laboratory for scientific study. Rather than collect specimens from museums or zoos, for this generation of field biologists, place-based conservation was crucial. And when foreign naturalists used that laboratory metaphor, they were arguing not just for the importance of field work, but also for a specific vision for protecting the islands. And their ideas reflected a romanticized view of pristine nature that was central to the creation of US national parks, as well as European models of parks created explicitly for scientific use. So in the middle of the book is a chapter that details the founding of the Charles Darwin Research Station and the Galapagos National Park. This is a picture of the Darwin Station's first building that was dedicated in 1964. The Darwin Station and the park were founded on paper, at least in 1959. It was largely the work of US and European scientists working through UNESCO and the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And so I did some research about who was involved in this and looked at their correspondence and the way that they framed their arguments, and they had to convince the government of Ecuador to to allocate this, like the entire archipelago, to a national park. And my research has shown this to be a neo-colonial endeavor that was led in part by a scientist who had been working in the Belgian Congo, who moved to focus on Galapagos during the period when African nations were becoming independent. And many European scientists were afraid of losing access to the tropical places where they did research. So white foreign scientists justified their intervention in the Galapagos through an environmental white savior narrative, one that's probably familiar, that they knew better how to see the true value of the archipelago and how to protect it than the Ecuadorians, who they saw as mismanaging the islands and allowing for the exploitation of their fauna. In the Galapagos, what this meant then was that it was mostly white foreigners who were initially interested in conservation, with some notable exceptions. And that had impacts for the kind of conservation that was imagined. So saving this natural laboratory became the dominant framework. And that meant protecting an isolated space of nature as much as possible. Ecuadorian scientists, there were two in particular who were involved in this, had a slightly different vision. It was less about pristine nature and much more about developing fisheries, economies. It was much closer to what we would call sustainable development today. But the natural laboratory metaphor was the one that went forward with, which raises this really interesting question about the Galapagos, which is just how does one save evolution? And I have a couple chapters at the end of the book that really dive into this question. And so one chapter in particular asks this question. And my answer is that it has to do with twin strategies that are focused on making live endemic and native species like the giant tortoises through the breeding centers, but also making die introduced and invasive species, particularly goats. And I argue in the book that this isn't natural, but this is conservationist selection. And I think for people who don't work in the conservation world, this is really maybe interesting, even surprising, because conservation isn't just a matter of like putting up a fence to protect desired species. A lot more work goes into conservation. And with that work come a lot of ethical questions as well. So I'll talk first a little bit about the work of conservation breeding. I volunteered for a month in 2011 at the Fausto Urena Giant Tortoise Breeding Center on Santa Cruz Island. You can see Fausto in the upper left corner. He is stacking a wheelbarrow full of branches of a plant called otoi that the tortoises love to stack on. On the picture below that with the two men, you can see excavating nests where a female tortoise has laid eggs and then covered them, and they are taking these eggs out of the nests within the breeding center, and actually they'll put them in an incubator where they will incubate for several months until the babies hatch. And then once the babies hatch, they're reared at the center for about 5 years until they're large enough to withstand predation by rats, which are also invasive on most of the islands. And then at that point, they are repatriated or retortoised, as they say in Galapagos, to the home island of their species. And this has been enormously successful. The program started back in 1965, and up until last year, they had repatriated something like 10,000 baby tortoises across the archipelago. There are some island populations that have done so well that they actually have closed down the breeding now because they think there are plenty of tortoises on that island that they'll be able to regenerate a historical population size naturally. So this is the part that folks, you can go see as a tourist. You can take tours through these breeding centers. It's encouraged. It's very much on display in the Galapagos because this is a happy story, right? But the flip side of this story is something that most folks don't learn nearly as much about. And that's this issue of making die the invasive species. And so hunting has always been a central line of conservation work in the Galapagos. And one of the first park guards told me, basically, that was our profession, to kill animals. So for decades, teams of 3 to 5 men would live out on remote islands with a team of dogs, and they would hunt goats and wild boar. Now, goats in particular were a problem because they reproduce so quickly and they can strip a landscape bare of vegetation, as you see in these pictures from Santiago. Another park guard who was in charge of restoration in the 1990s, told me that by the end of the decade, he knew that this hunting method wasn't working. So every month, these men who were out on the islands would kill 3,000 or 4,000 goats, and then they would move on to another island. But when they came back and rotated it around again, the goat population would have returned. And he said it was like nothing had happened, like they never had killed any of the goats. They just kept coming back. And so it became evident that conservationists really needed a new strategy for thinking about evolution of these, not evolution, of how to get rid of these invasive species. And so in about the year 2000, they looked to New Zealand, where similar concerns about protecting native island fauna from invasion had led to the development of specialist conservation hunting. There, sharpshooters hunted from helicopters using Judas animals collared with radio transmitters to track their prey. An international workshop and an exploratory trip persuaded Galápagos conservationists that this was the model they should follow if they ever wanted to really clean the Galápagos of unwanted ungulates. As one biologist explained to me, island eradication campaigns require the death of every last introduced animal. Failing to find even one pregnant female goat means that the population could potentially regenerate. And that required this level of precision hunting that they hadn't been using before. And so they developed a $50 million project for what they called a total control plan for permanent control of invasive species. And that included a big push eradication campaign, institutional capacity building, and quarantine systems to prevent future introductions. Now, the core of the project ran from 1998 to 2006, focused primarily on eradicating the goats on Santiago Island and on Isabella Island as well. One project leader framed this in biblical terms. He said, I'm quoting here, "We're rather like a collective Noah, deciding with a biblical coldness which life forms will be able to accompany us on our new journey in the ark." So this flood was to wash the islands in a deluge of bloodshed and goat carcasses. It was a big budget, high modern hunt of epic proportion. 60 local hunters were trained in precision hunting and used automatic rifles for ground and air campaigns with helicopters to speed the process and allow access to difficult terrain. The arsenal for this assault included semi-automatic rifles, exploding bullets, telescopic sights, global positioning systems, two-way radios, nylon nets, and 1 million rounds of ammunition imported from the United States, an order that apparently prompted a quick phone call from the US State Department they were apparently concerned about the prospect of an armed insurgency in this Latin American state. Now, to locate these difficult to reach populations, the Galápagos team used Judas goats that were tagged with radio telemetry devices to lead hunters to a group of target animals. You can see in the pictures here, they also had tracking dogs with them as well. And the idea of Judas goats is that as Judas Iscariot betrayed Jesus, tracker animals betray their kin by helping hunters locate herds to kill. The method, as one conservationist wrote, exploits the gregarious nature of goats, leveraging their sociality as a lure. Now, hunters argue that the use of Judas animals allows for more humane killing because of the speed that it facilitates. But even if Judas hunting might be more humane for the target goats, it's certainly not for the Judas animals themselves, who repeatedly see their packs killed and have to find a new pack. Now, Judas work also exploits the reproductive biology of goats as well. In addition to collaring goats with telemetry trackers and tagging them in red paint, conservationists also sterilize these goats because pregnancy would make female goats ineffective work animals. Instead of seeking out new reproductive partners, expectant mothers added to the populations they were supposed to be helping to eliminate, and they spent time away from herds to give birth and to care for their young. Now, traditionally, hunters shot newborn kids to encourage the Judas mothers to seek out a new pack. Well, one of the Galápagos project leaders, an Australian conservation biologist, did his dissertation research on improving the efficiency of Judas goats. The ideal goats, he said, would be sterilized, but in a way that didn't negatively affect their sociability, as castration did for males. He tested methods that would retain the animal's sexual motivation while preventing reproduction. The more sex, the better. I'm quoting here, nymphomaniac behavior would be desirable in Judas goat operations, he wrote, but it's unknown how to induce this condition. But through experiments on female goats, he developed a new model of Judas goats that were put into prolonged estrus with hormone implants. And he called these Matahari goats, named after the Dutch courtesan who spied for Germany during World War I. And they would continue to attract males without becoming impregnated. But Campbell's solution to this conservation problem folded the biological cause of goats' invasive force actually to work in the hunter's favor. Now, this project aiming for total control over nature has been construed as a major success in the world of island conservation, demonstrating the feasibility of large-scale eradication programs on islands. Hunters used 800 Judas goats to kill 152,000 of their kin on Isabella and Santiago Islands. And you can see in the map here with all of these tiny blue dots, each of those dots is a kill, a goat kill that was tracked with a GPS unit. So this presents, they also did a kind of cost analysis of this. On Isabella, which is the largest island and has the largest number of goats, the cost per kill was $47. On a much smaller island with fewer goats, it was $1,200 per goat. And so the project reports from this present a technocratic, economized view of death that puts the focus of killing on efficiency and deflects it from ethical and political issues. In my interviews, particularly with residents on Isabella, where community relationships with the National Park Service have long been pretty contentious, residents challenged the project from multiple perspectives. Some took issue with the idea of eradication because goat meat is a dietary staple in Ecuador, and local people depended on the animals. Conservationists didn't target domestically kept goats, but locals thought feral populations should be usefully rather than categorically killed. They found goat eradication wasteful because of wasted meat. All the carcasses were left in place for practical and logistical reasons of moving them, because of wasted opportunity to employ more local hunters, and wasted resources they thought should have been spent on other causes, such as making clean water more available in the archipelago. The local resentment of the project went beyond utility. In a place where residents have long defended their right to live in the islands, some charged that conservationists wanted to eradicate human residents as well as the goats, that the helicopters that would buzz over town were actually threatening the residents themselves. Now, the conservationists that I spoke to said that this absolutely was not the case, but it speaks to these histories of animosity and the way that local populations would read and interpret some of what was going on. So the after effects of the goat eradication, though, also call into question the political and ecological feasibility of restoring an evolutionary Eden. The project reports show triumphant photographs of vegetation rebounding on Santiago, and studies have shown that the Galapagos rail and hawk populations are also rebounding. But also necessary, it became clear, was better understanding of the role that goats had come to play in island ecosystems. Conservation biologists knew that they denuded landscapes, but what became apparent after the eradication was just how much they had also held in check introduced plants, particularly blackberry, dense thickets of which are an especially pernicious problem in the agricultural highlands of Isabella and Santa Cruz Islands, as well as other woody vegetation, which now covers most of Pinta Island. Now, political responses have also threatened the long-term success of eradication. Shortly after Project Isabella ended, someone introduced 6 goats to Santiago. Another goat soon appeared on Darwin Island, which is very far in the north of the archipelago. And park wardens were able to find and kill these goats. It cost them about $5,000 each because of the effort that it took to track them down. But the reintroductions demonstrate that eradication is a contingent achievement that's always susceptible to acts of defiance, particularly when you have a population that is unpleased with some of the conservation projects. Galápagos residents have found multiple grounds for criticizing this goat eradication, but their experience invokes a shared history with goats and other island species. That history is discounted in conservationist logics that judge what belongs in the islands according to what evolved there. Eradication campaigns depend on a reductive understanding of ecology that focuses on a few key species and an idealized view of a past state of nature. The presumption is that either tortoises or goats, but not both, can and should survive. But as environmental philosopher Tom Van Doren argues, no matter how much and how many we kill, our goal cannot be to put things back to how they once were. Rather, we're killing to produce valued natures. And such values are not universally held. The goals of total eradication eclipse thorny political questions about how different groups value nature. As the goat reintroductions warn, such elisions have consequences. And I think conservation needs a broader frame for understanding the stakes and entanglements of eradication work that acknowledge multiple and conflicting ways of valuing nature. So I will conclude briefly by saying that conservationists have worked really intensely over the past half century to protect evolution in this natural laboratory of the Galápagos. And in many ways, their work has been remarkably successful. Today, some 20,000 giant tortoises are thought to live in the wild and to reproduce in situ. And the eradication of goats and rats also has set a precedent of possibility for island conservation around the world. But that doesn't amount to restoring an evolutionary Eden. The language of restoration, which is so prominent in conservation biology today, is misleading. The choice is neither a return to an Edenic past, nor an acceptance of a novel ecological state. Evolution, as conservationists know, is far more complicated than that. Nature is always evolving, it's always novel. And the idea of restoring evolution is born more of powerful conservationist imaginaries than of biological theory. It's an inherent contradiction that plays out as conservationists debate how best to protect endangered species and their island habitats. Acknowledging that evolution is always novel doesn't mean abandoning conservation. It doesn't mean abandoning quarantine systems that attempt to protect the archipelago from new pests. But it does mean, but acknowledging that evolution is always novel does mean grappling with difficult questions instead of relying on a presumed Edenic baseline as the foundation on which conservation stands. It also means acknowledging that the closer one gets to nature, whether chasing goats, hacking away at blackberry, the better one sees how nature shifts and moves and exceeds human control. The simplified rhetoric of restoration, I think, is a political tool, a way of imagining conservation as if it were not active selection weighted with ethical valuations and assertions about who and what belong in the archipelago, but rather the straightforward act of returning order to a messy world. But there's not one real Galápagos to restore. I think conservation cannot start from the premise that nature is or should be separate from human society. And tracking tortoise histories, I think, reveals the deep entanglements of natures and cultures and allows us to instead open up far more difficult questions about what kinds of relationships and species should be conserved by whom and for whom. So I will end there. Thank you very much.
The questions are going to be, I'm really looking forward to that. Humans are such tinkerers, aren't they? And that whole idea of being the steward of our planet, you have really turned that for me upside down. We live here. We don't own it. I do have a question from Al Christians, who happens to be sitting right beside me. Let me just get in the picture there. There you go.
Great.
Okay. You just said that, well, it's not this, the answer is not this, and it's not this. And I wonder if you have, to me, the metaphors that apparently apply here are either the world is a tar baby and everything you do to try to get rid of it, get rid of the problems, make them worse, or, well, we're on a ride down an infinitely long river with lots of rapids and we're never going to be past it to the end. We've got to be very careful until our boat tips over and then we don't have to be careful anymore. What's the metaphor or the override or the philosophical approach that you've picked up from all of this work for looking at the overall problems of how do you manage the earth?
Yeah, that's a big question, Al. Thank you. I do think that part of the reason that I wanted to kind of introduce all of these problems and the wrenches and throw some wrenches in the thinking of conservation is that it is taken such a face value. I think that the conservationists have so much rhetorical purchase that seems like, I mean, it is such a worthy cause, right? But there are a lot more ethical questions behind this idea of saving nature or saving species. You know, there are Galapagos Conservancy organizations that always are sending out emails like, help us save the penguins, help us do that. And it's like, absolutely donate to those things. But those also come with questions about what else is going on in the archipelago. And I think for me, it's really, I don't have a great metaphor off the top of my head to counteract the rushing river, which is kind of scary way to think about life. But for me, it's much more about the kind of democratic process, or like setting up a better process for how we think about conservation decision-making. So for a really long time in Galapagos, it was done by foreigners who had much more money than the local municipal government, than the state government. And the local population in the Galapagos, which has boomed dramatically because of tourism, which I haven't talked about at all yet, you know, they really weren't consulted. They were kind of always told, like, this isn't really your place, right? Like, you might live here, but they were never encouraged to feel the kind of, like, I don't know, respect for place or like guardianship of place that I think a lot of us feel with our hometowns or with the communities in which we live. And so there's always been this rhetoric, and people in the Galapagos sometimes refer to themselves as invasive species. And I think that's so problematic for creating a kind of identity in a community that really wants to care about local environments. And on top of that, like I mentioned, water supply in Galapagos is terrible. Everyone drinks purified bottled water. The water that comes through the tap isn't really clean to bathe with or to wash your dishes with. So folks dip their dishes in a Clorox solution and bleach after they wash them to try and kill all of the microbiota that are in the water supply. And so there are things that have much more to do with environmental justice and a different way of thinking about conservation and a different way of thinking about what natures need help in the Galapagos. It isn't just the tortoises and the penguins and the birds there.
I see Dave DiNucci has a question. Come on in, Dave.
I had a chance to take care of a tortoise as a pet, a very large tortoise. Somebody had it in their yard, and it was kind of fun to watch it go around and eat everything in the yard, but it actually would eat anything in the yard. And I noticed, I mean, it got to be almost a joke of what this tortoise would be able to eat and expel later on and just survive through the whole thing. So I was wondering, are these tortoises very delicate in their situation? I mean, how in this conservation effort, there's obviously some death going on. Is that just from predation, or is that from other things?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the tortoises are very hardy animals in Galapagos once they've reached adult size, at least. And it is true, you know, when I was volunteering at the center, we would throw them our orange peels and our banana peels, and they would chomp them up, delightful. But they would also, if they had access to it, eat plastic. Yeah. I had little babies trying to eat my tivas at one point because they were green. You know, they're really pretty, they're very captivating to watch. And sometimes when it was feeding time, they would literally like crawl over each other as if they were crawling over a rock or something to get to food. So they're not animals that live in social groups, which is why they do things like that. But they are very determined and really hardy animals. And their hardiness is part of the reason that the conservation reproduction program has been so successful, because they were able, you know, it took like 20 years to really figure out how to get that running smoothly. And so they would, you know, try and raise babies, and they incubate them in different kinds of incubators. And now they have these really fancy modern ovens, but back in the day they had built like a kind of stone house that was heated by the sun, and it was too close to the beach, and the eggs didn't do very well because it was too humid. And so they moved one inland farther, and that did better. And they realized that they really needed lights so they could have consistent temperature. And it took a while then to figure out, and how do you rear, like they had a rearing house that was indoors originally, and realized that that was not a good idea because they needed a lot of sunshine. They needed a lot of sunlight. And so they made rearing pens that are outdoors now with some shade. And so it took a long time to figure those kind of things out, and to get the survival rates of the breeding program in the breeding centers up, I think over 86, 80, 90%. When the babies are repatriated, they wait until they're about 5 years old, or about the size of a salad plate. And that's because they are very susceptible to rats. And that is mostly predation. So it is mostly predation that jeopardizes the tortoises in the wild today, which is why they want to go, like they're doing massive eradication campaigns right now, as well as the goat eradications. And so, yeah, the rats they will try and get into tortoise nests and eat the eggs. And so there are programs on the inhabited islands where park guards go out, and I actually did this with them a couple times, and go and find nests every breeding season and cover them with wire mesh so that the rats can't get in. They put some rocks around the side, being careful that it doesn't block the sunlight. And then they'll go back out several months later when it's time for the babies, when they're hatching, and actually help them escape from the nets and the wire and remove that. And then they, scurry off into the underbrush and hide mostly for several years until they're big enough to withstand lots of it's a difficult landscape in the Galápagos, and there are these predators too. But the rats sometimes will, in addition to eating eggs, they will gnaw on the limbs of these baby tortoises, and it's really pretty ugly. So once they're 5 years or so, then when they're repatriated to their home islands, the survival rate is about 50%. And that sounds pretty bad, but is actually a really very successful reintroduction rate for wild species. So this is why it's considered such a success story.
We have a question from Jessica Curtis. What would happen if we treat the humans in the Galápagos as desirable to move to new homes, like something of those in the area likely be flooded with the rising ocean? Not that it would be easy to do in a respectful and humane way, but I think what she's saying is we got people off the island. Got them to leave is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, so folks have actually tried this before. It never went very far, but in the late 80s and 1990s, there were several foreign conservationists who floated proposals like this. Well, why don't we incentivize people not to move to Galápagos, but to move them elsewhere? And it's a political non-starter. It's like very much an electric rail in Ecuadorian politics. And that is because of the tourism industry, and because it is such a cash cow for the Ecuadorian economy. Galápagos is like the golden egg of this tourism economy in Ecuador. And it's also because, tourism needs Ecuadorians to live in the islands. They act as tour guides, they work in the national park, they work in conservation, they work in restaurants and shops, they work in all kinds of support businesses like glassware making, and they work as cooks and cleaners. Well, there's a whole economy that supports the tourism industry. And so the ability for foreigners to go and visitors to go, Ecuadorians go and tour too, it really depends on there being a local economy. And so it's a difficult situation of figuring out how to balance that with conservation desires. And so that's also part of the reason that I want to push back on this idea that the Galápagos should be an unpeopled place, because there was no indigenous human population in the Galápagos, and they were first they first entered the annals of Western history in 1535 when a Spanish bishop was drifted into the archipelago by accident and wrote home to the Spanish crown about the islands. But conservationists tended to really privilege that date and what happened before it as the kind of, they hold that up as the goal. And I think we need to get away from that and think about, okay, we have this situation where there are about 35,000 people who live in the Galápagos today. And so how do we best manage that the way it is with conservation and with tourism? A kind of perverse result of the tourism industry as well. And so organized tours to Galapagos, I in some ways consider Darwin a tourist. There were all sorts of rich folks and sailors who visited the Galapagos for centuries, but organized tourism in the way that we understand nature tourism today really started in the late 1960s and 1970s. And then about 5,000 people would go, and it was roughing it. You stayed on a little tiny sailboat all week. There were not bathrooms, there were no cabins, there was not a chef on board. You caught your fish, you could go pretty much wherever your boat captain would take you. Today it is radically different than that. National Geographic runs a massive 100-person ship that's beautiful, and there's, my mom and I took a sailboat cruise when I was there, and you have a 5-star chef on board. It's amazing, the food is great, and you go to very controlled itineraries on the cruises. But as a result of the way that tourism has increased, so from 2000 to about 200,000 people before the pandemic, at the same time, the population of the islands has grown from about 2,000 people in 1959 to 35,000 people today. In 1998, there was passed what's called the Special Law for Galapagos, which is a piece of legislation that enshrines sustainable development as the kind of overarching goal for Galapagos, and also limits the ability of people to own property in the islands. And so it was trying to limit the number of Ecuadorians who would be able to move out there. It's been unpopular in many ways politically, because now to move to the Galapagos, you have to have a job or you have to marry into a family that lives out there. It's like saying you couldn't just up and move to Hawaii because you want to move to Hawaii. And it's difficult to get a job in the Galapagos because you really have to be there to get a job, and then you have to return and then come back with your permit. It's kind of a ridiculous system, but it hasn't really worked. And actually the growth rates of the local population have actually boomed since the special law. So it's growing at a faster rate now than it was previously, but that's because the tourism industry is growing so quickly too.
Dave Gray is asking, is there a significant climate change there? Have they been experiencing the results of climate change?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I get pretty frequently, and I don't have a great answer because it's not really is the kind of answer. And Galapagos there are several reasons for that. And one is that most of the islands are most of the settlements where people live are not terribly close to sea level. There are tall cliffs between much of where folks live and the ocean. There have been, one year when I was there was a bad tsunami, and that was related to El Nino. But the Galapagos has always had really strong El Nino and La Nina effects. And so they, in that way, consider themselves kind of a test case for what might come in other places with climate change, but they haven't, that dramatically changes the rainfall on the islands and the temperature of the ocean. And so there's a lot of change that goes on with those, and they happen pretty regularly. But they don't, I think, and partly it's because that has always been the case in Galapagos. The animals are pretty hardy, and we don't have the same kind of population effects, at least for native species. In terms of human populations, the tsunami did cause a bunch of damage for folks that had beachfront properties. But the islands really aren't in danger of disappearing like some South Pacific islands are.
Dave Peterson asks, what do you think would happen if the breeding program was stopped and tourism and all intrusion into the environment was stopped? It would just it sounds like just leave it alone, just stay away.
I think, well, they are winding down the breeding program. And so I think that, a lot of the tortoise populations are recovering on their own and they're pretty healthy in situ now. And so the breeding program in some ways, like in the 21st century, is like icing on top of it to kind of speed things along that we hope are going to continue naturally. I think, like, if everyone left, honestly, I think that it's a kind of an impossible dream, right? There's a huge marine reserve around the Galápagos, and part of the reason for that is because the waters are such rich fishing waters. So there has always been a population of illegal fishers, a lot of industrial fishers that come from Asia and fish Galápagos waters. So I think that if, all the conservationists and the well-meaning folks and the tourists left, you would see just an open space for a kind of frontier mentality and like economy that would exploit the resources there. There's a black market for endangered species every year. Usually someone gets arrested for trying to smuggle out iguanas or baby tortoises from the Galápagos. And so I think you'd see more of that illicit activity happening.
That opportunity has passed. I mean, it's just the humans have reached every spot on this planet and are effective there. Even the idea of you talking about the blackberries, well, of course, if the goats came, they brought the seeds that came with that environment, and that's wild blackberries, which we deal with a lot here in Oregon.
Yeah.
The ivy. Dorman Blazer has a question. I think you've addressed this a little bit already. Looking at likely 200 feet rise in sea level over time, what ecological changes will be happening there? You've addressed this a little bit, but you want to just summarize that again?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a great question, and I don't have great answers because I haven't done any of the modeling of those kind of situations in Galápagos. I mean, clearly, when we get to that drastic of a point in sea level, like the towns will change, the ports will be mostly underwater, and I really don't know how to say that what will happen to the tortoises. I think the tortoises will probably not really be affected, honestly, because they are so hardy and because they will withstand the El Nino. What would be more impactful for them would be an increased frequency in El Nino rains. And one of the scientists that I works with, her hypothesis is that the way the tortoises actually diversified, or like spread from island to island, 1 million years ago, because of the El Nino rains, like just wash everything off of the islands. They can move boulders down. And so she thinks that the tortoises just got washed to sea. They're not animals that are going to like wander to the beach and go into the ocean by choice.
And they just lucked out
and some lucked out and were pregnant, or there were two and washed up on other islands. It's really amazing the degree of chance involved. And so I think but when there are a lot of El Nino rains, you get the bigger, hardier tortoises can withstand that. They try and like get as much sunshine out of that as they can, but the juveniles really can't deal with that, right? They can't withstand those kinds of rains. They are so small and the temperature swings are such a big deal for them that would, I think, then start to diminish populations again.
What is the temperatures at the Galápagos? What are their ranges?
Yeah, so it's it's often about 75, 80 degrees. In March and April, it will get hotter than that. There are two main seasons. There's a rainy season, which you have like maybe one strong downpour a day. And then there is the dry season, in which it's actually kind of foggy and misty rain almost all the time. So
it's not a real pleasant place to live then.
It's not bad, it's warm, and the rainy season, it's like alternating really strong sun and kind of torrential rains, but it's really very little variation across the year. So the temperatures, it's only like a 10-degree swing in Fahrenheit.
So tropical.
Yeah, definitely tropical. It's not nearly as hot as Caribbean islands, and that's because of the ocean currents and the winds that ensconce the Galapagos and keep the waters there much cooler than a lot of other tropical places.
You have, with the eradication of the goats and sharing that story, I'm sure that the conservationists would have preferred that stay hidden. It makes sense. But what kind of reaction are you getting from conservationists right now that you're putting a spotlight on the killing side of conservation?
I haven't really heard, when I have presented this for groups of conservationists, it's in mostly academic spaces. And so folks are kind of, I think, in those spaces primed to engage with these kind of ideas and think about criticisms of them more than perhaps if I went to give a talk at the Galápagos National Park to the park guards, right? I've had of the academics, people have been really receptive. And I think that is because I really tried to be fair in the way that I was presenting the rationale for doing eradication. And I didn't read all of that part to you today, because there are real biological reasons that you eradicate. And I think that also I talk to a lot of students in my work, and a lot of conservation biology students are they get in it for all the right reasons, right? They want to save the world and save the environment. And then as they get into it, they realize that it's a lot more complicated. And I think that they don't often, because their training is so focused on biology and policy management, they don't often really get the chance to talk through all of those issues. And I think in Galapagos, if I were to give this talk to some of the people who are running the program definitely would prefer not to have external engagement with what's going on. And, one of the women who was running this program, she would give talks about it. And she's like, there's a PETA volunteer at every talk telling me that I'm a terrible person because I'm killing animals. And so there is that response, right? But in Galapagos, the park guards who actually do this work are honestly, some of them are traumatized by it. And it's really difficult. And I have, there's a great paper by an anthropologist who I knew who really interviewed a lot of the hunters on this program and was talking about, it was like, sometimes they were like, oh, the pregnant females, I just feel too bad. I can't kill them. And then the people in charge of the program would have to come back and say okay, no, you need to give me an ear tag or something that is going to prove that you actually killed that animal, because I can't let them live and have this eradication project work. And so I think that there are a lot more aspects of conservation that need to be talked about. And the guy that I interviewed, who was one of the first two park guards, trained at a forestry school that was run by the FAO. And so he got to Galapagos then, and it's not about forestry management in Galapagos. It's about invasive species and native species. And so he's being sent out to kill goats and boars. He was like, this is not what school taught me. Wow. And so it was a real shift in what he was expecting too.
Well, and I can imagine shooting an animal from a helicopter and leaving the carcass, not really knowing if that animal is suffering. That's not a hunter's code at all, at least the hunters that I know. You make sure that the animal is not suffering. You make sure the meat is used. This is carnage, and it would be very upsetting to a person. It just makes me realize this really has that humans get involved in tinkering when they really don't know the whole story. And once you get into the whole story, you realize that the tinkering gets so complicated to keep the balance. Mm-hmm. And Jessica had a point that wouldn't the carcasses that the deaths leave of the goats increase the rat population because they would have such a wonderful food source?
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point. There are big questions about what happens to the ammunition that killed all those goats. And now stays in the ecosystem too, right? Like I had conservationists make this argument of like, well, you know, we should leave the carcasses, because it's practically impossible to remove 150,000 goat carcasses on a place where you have, like, there's remote islands, there are no refrigeration storage areas, like they would rot so quickly and the helicopters would be, like, I understand why they did that. But she was saying, well, you know, they've been part of the ecosystem, and so we should let the nutrients and the, you know, the chemicals and the biology that's in their systems become part of the ecosystem again, right? And like continue those cyclical exchanges. But I think that ignores some other things too.
It certainly does. It's a very complicated system, and I am so appreciative of your willingness to take the time to write this book and do this research, this extensive research, and then to complete the project, see it to the end. You should be very proud of yourself. And
well, thank you. It was it was a fascinating project and a very nice place to go do research. So I'm very lucky too.
A lot of work. And we're going to stop now for a few announcements, and but if you'd like to stay on for our afterthoughts, you'd be very welcome, but please do not feel at all obligated. But if you have a little extra time, I know folks would enjoy continuing the conversation at the close of the meeting. But I want to send a hearty round of applause. Thank you so much. Thank you.